My name is Jan Harzan. I'm the Executive Director for MUFON. We are a scientific research organization that basically collects sighting reports from the public and then goes and investigates them. Our mission statement as an organization is the scientific study of UFOs for the benefit of humanity, and we have three primary goals. We investigate UFO reports, we promote research into the UFO subject, and we educate the public on our findings. We have 3,000 members worldwide. Many scientists, physicists, PhDs, metallurgists, biologists, all the way down to just the average citizen who really wants to get involved. Some of those have chosen to become field investigators, and they go through our field investigative training courses. They become part of the team in their state or country where they reside, and they actually get engaged in going out and meeting this phenomena head on. We've recently formed a science review board, and that board is made up of scientists from around the United States and around the world to review some of our more significant cases and try to render an opinion on them. What we'd like to do is be more outbound, more outspoken in terms of the really true UFO cases. So MUFON is moving forward with this approach, and we'll be publishing papers in these different areas to allow the general public and even the scientific community to be able to be challenged by what we're finding. That's the strength of MUFON as an organization, is being really the truth seekers of the UFO field.
Our next speaker, who's a private pilot and military aerospace historian, is Michael Schratt. He currently works as an aerospace draftsman in Tempe, Arizona. Michael has lectured across the country on the unique subject of mystery aircraft and classified propulsion systems buried deep within the military-industrial complex. Michael has developed a number of contacts which have had first-hand experience dealing with classified black programs, including former United States Air Force pilots, retired naval personnel, and aerospace engineers that have maintained and received a top-secret Q clearance. Let me invite to the stage Mr. Michael Schratt to talk about bombshell UFO cases.
Here you are. Well, good afternoon, everyone. First of all, I want to thank Clifford for giving me the opportunity to join all of you today. And what I'd like to do for you this afternoon is just give you a brief overview of some of the classified aircraft that have been developed within the military-industrial complex. I'm going to break this down into three distinct segments. We're going to be talking about black programs. That's any program that has less than 5% congressional oversight. We'll be considering deep black programs. And then we'll be considering what's called a USAF, or Unacknowledged Special Access Program. From that point, I want to switch gears and show you a number of potential extraterrestrial vehicles, and I'm going to allow you, the audience, to decide which category these craft fall in. Do they fall in the man-made category or the extraterrestrial category? So with that said, we have a lot of information to cover. I'd like to go ahead and begin at this point. It's appropriate that we begin here. This is the most recently declassified aircraft, an aircraft called the Boeing Phantom Works Bird of Prey, declassified October 2002 under the Bush administration. This was the first aircraft to use low-cost disposable tooling, single-piece aircraft construction, and 3D virtual design reality type techniques. 38 test flights were made between 1992 and 1999. A procurement of $67 million was funded by Boeing for this particular project. Now, it's interesting to note, for this particular program, Boeing Phantom Works Bird of Prey, this was a Boeing proprietary program, so we as taxpayers did not have to foot the bill for this particular program. So Boeing Phantom Works Bird of Prey, very low radar cross-section aircraft. Moving on then to the A-12 Avenger II. This was a joint McDonnell Douglas General Dynamics program. Interesting to note that their procurement was going to be for 620 of these aircraft to be built. But on January 7th of 1991, Dick Cheney cut this program, totally canceled this program at the cost of $5 billion to taxpayers. Ladies and gentlemen, we have absolutely nothing to show for the A-12 Avenger 2. It's an absolute Greek tragedy. Is there a mismanagement of funding here? Absolutely. Now, how do we track these programs? Detroit Free Press, Secret Ledger hides military projects. Pentagon black budget has tripled under the Reagan administration. This is very near the end of the Reagan administration, published here on February 8th of 1987. And they give you this chart here. We'll break this down very quickly here. 1981 procurement funding increase in spending for research and development on the military black budget was just over $500 million. That's how much it increased. By 1988, that figure rose to $9.122 billion. Moving over to the second chart here, you can see here that for education, it was $25 billion. For transportation, it was $28 billion. But you'll notice here, ladies and gentlemen, that the procurement funding for fiscal year 1988 for the Pentagon's black budget was $35 billion, of which the Air Force budget total for that year was $51.1 billion. Their black budget for the Air Force was $19.1 billion. Tacit Blue, Northrop Tacit Blue was the first aircraft to use a quad redundant fly-by-wire flight control system with a side scanning radar. Total procurement funding was $165 million for this particular program. It's now on display at the Air Force Museum in Dayton, Ohio, if you'd like to take a look at it. It's earned a few nicknames here. I wrote them down very briefly. Northrop Tacit Blue nicknames. They called it Willie the Whale. It's been known as Shamu, the inverted bathtub, the flying snow shovel, and also the flying loaf of bread. Now, we heard reports that perhaps there was some secret aircraft flying in conjunction with the F-117A stealth fighter during Operation Desert Storm. Do we have anything to validate these claims, as Popular Mechanics had pointed out here? This is a very well done pencil sketch drawing by my good friend Mark McCandlish, who is the premier aerospace illustrator in the world. This is based on eyewitness testimony of individuals who've actually seen this aircraft. It's actually called the Manta Ray. It is carrier capable. It is a digital real-time reconnaissance intelligence gathering aircraft that actually did fly with the F-117A during Operation Desert Storm. Single pilot, 2 inward canted vertical stabilizers about 30 degrees from the vertical axis. Of course, you'll see the 2 air intakes here. And it's interesting to note that the first flight of this aircraft took place at the remote test site in Nevada, also known as Area 51, back in 1981. By 1983, the squadron of these aircraft had moved to Holloman Air Force Base. So what information do we have to validate the existence of the Manta Ray? Well, we've got a very reliable report, ladies and gentlemen, from a KC-135 boom operator who refueled one of these aircraft during Operation Desert Storm. We also have the testimony of a fire control suppression officer who is at the Long Beach McDonnell Douglas facility right around 88, who saw a squadron of these depart the area. And we also have the reports from Aviation Week Space Technology reported in the 1989 issue indicating that there was a squadron of these operating out of the Edwards North Base facility. The Sneaky Pete Vantage by the Task Research Incorporated. This was the first aircraft that could be flown by remote control or with a pilot as a backup. This is the forerunner, ladies and gentlemen, of today's UAVs and UCAVs. That's Unmanned Combat Aerial Vehicle. Now, I thought this was interesting because I had been on the trail of this aircraft for a number of years. I really wanted to get a photograph of this aircraft. I knew the first flight was in 1982 by Dick Rattan at Mojave International Airport, but the Air Force refused to declassify a photograph of Sneaky Pete that you see up here now. So I tested the, quote, Obama transparency on government policy. I wanted to see if my tax dollars would actually procure a photograph of this. So I sent in a FOIA request to the DOD, also the Air Force, requesting a photograph of what you see here. My request came back, no records, so clearly there is no Obama transparency on government policy. It's non-existent. I had to go to the prime contractor personally. He sent me this photograph, and that's what you see here for the first time. Now we're moving on to daytime stealth technology. If you'll recall, during Operation Desert Storm, primarily all the F-117A stealth fighter missions and sorties were flown during nighttime operations. We now have the technology to do the same mission using electrochromic panels during daytime operations. And what we're doing here is we're taking an image of what's in back of the aircraft. We're electronically transferring that image via electrochromic panels to the forward section of the vehicle, essentially making it blend in with the background, completely invisible to the eye. So we've got the technology now. Popular science, America's $1 billion high-flying 4,400-mile-an-hour ramjet spy plane. When the SR-71 was retired for the first time in 1989, we heard all these reports that there's a new secret aircraft that the Air Force or perhaps the National Reconnaissance Office or even the CIA is actually working on. We believe it may look very similar to this aircraft, perhaps called the M151 TAV, also known as the Brilliant Buzzard two-stage-to-orbit space plane. This has been given the gentleman's nod by Ben Rich. Ben Rich was the retired Lockheed Skunk Works engineer who took over the reins of the Skunk Works from Kelly Johnson back in 1975. The fuselage measures about 276 feet in length. It has a crew of 3. There is a pilot, co-pilot, and launch control officer. He serves as the liaison between the mothership and the parasitic aircraft. Interesting to note that the third person here sits in the aft position so that he can see the parasitic aircraft. There are 2 combined cycle turbo ramjet engines using a modified liquid methane fuel. They have very interesting trapezoidal cut air inlets that you can fit a Volkswagen Beetle in this. It's very large air intakes. There's 2 of them on either side of the center line of the vehicle. You can see these 16-foot tall winglets on the terminating section of the wing here. So we're talking about a very high-flying, approximately Mach 5, about 120,000 feet. The parasitic aircraft on top can get up to Mach 15. They use a supersonic combustion ramjet or scramjet. They also have a small liquid rocket at the end of this vehicle that can propel this right around 15,000 miles an hour. This is another version of it here. It has a twin canard section in the forward section for low-speed applications. So what evidence do we have that this aircraft exists? Aviation Week Space Technology reported here recent sightings. This is right around vintage 1990 to 1993. Recent sightings of XB-70-like aircraft reinforce 1990 reports from Edwards area. Also, Aviation Week Space Technology, March 6, 2006. Black Star, another Groom Lake secret. So I just showed you the Lockheed two-stage-to-orbit space plane. Boeing also had one called the Black Star, where they are airdropping the parasitic aircraft from the belly of the mothership. That's what you see right here in this illustration. Again, this may look very similar to what that AvWeek article talked about with the recent sighting of the XB-70. Very similar to what was seen in that 1960s report. Further evidence of this aircraft comes from a U.S. patent, okay? 4,802,639. This is actually Boeing's patent. They're calling it a horizontal takeoff trans-atmospheric launch system from the Boeing company in Seattle, Washington. So again, ladies and gentlemen, I'm not making this up. We're seeing it right here in the government's own patents. It may be called Black Star SR-3 or the Trans-Orbital Vehicle. That's what you see here. Approximately 200 feet in length and 90 feet length for the parasitic aircraft. Copper Coast Copper Canyon TAV, Trans-Atmospheric Vehicle, procured under the Reagan administration under the Star Wars program, or SDI. Here was a 1984-1985 proposal. You can see here that they could do a missed approach. So they could actually screw up their original landing and go for a missed approach. Over here to the left, it says 3 orbit range, 100-mile altitude capability, 100 passenger capability. So you see Lockheed was working on a passenger version of this. Reagan's, quote, Oriental Express, LAX to Melbourne, Australia in 55 minutes. So that's the level of technology that we were working on under these Defense Department programs, vintage 1984, 1985. However, as you all know, we're still chugging along in these 747s. If we want to go to Cairo, we want to get to Paris, we're just chugging along in these obsolete 747s. Is there something better that we could have? Absolutely. Again, a different version of the Copper Coast program, trans-atmospheric vehicle. They're using liquid hydrogen, they're using liquid oxygen for fuel, also in some cases a boron-based additive. I definitely want to spend a few minutes about the Northrop B-2 stealth bomber. I personally believe that there's a lot more going on with the B-2 than meets the eye, absolutely. This I call the $10 billion photograph, ladies and gentlemen, because we've got 4 B-2s here in the assembly plant. Each B-2 costs $2.3 billion, more than its own weight in gold. So if you multiply 2.3 by 4, you've got approximately $10 billion right here. Now, the B-2 has a wingspan of 172 feet, and you'll see this double W, or saw-cut trailing edge. So this is exactly what you'll see at your local air show. But I ask the question, is there something more going on with the B-2 than meets the eye? Something that we're not being told about here. Aviation Week Space Technology, March 9th, 1992, interviewed a whole series of Northrop engineers who were working on the B-2 program. It says here, Black World engineers, scientists encourage using highly classified technology for civilian applications. So they're wondering why this technology is not being trickled down to civilian applications. In this article, they talk about how the B-2 electrically charges the leading edge of the wing to reduce the radar cross signature, then electrically charges the exhaust gases to reduce the infrared signature. But this is interesting because this is exactly what T. Townsend Brown had proposed in the 1930s when he did his reports and studies dealing with electrogravitics. Also of note, a 1968 report from Northrop indicated that when you electrically charge the leading edge of the wing, you can reduce your drag coefficient by up to 68%. A massive reduction in drag coefficient, thereby saving fuel consumption up to 68% as well. And this is why those engineers were very upset that this technology was not being trickled down to American Airlines, United Airlines. What would this technology be valued at for the American Airlines? Now, if you doubt me, I invite you to take a look at this book right here, Electrogravitic Systems, Thomas Vallone, reports on a new propulsion methodology. They clearly go into the specific details of how this may be employed on the Northrop B-2 stealth bomber. Special Projects Flight Test Squadron. So what are we looking at here? When you have a classified aircraft, you've got a flight test squadron, you've got support personnel, you've got refueling type apparatus. This is an actual patch from Air Force Flight Test Center Detachment 3, which is the spook terminology for Area 51. And I'll try to break this down for you here. What are we looking at here? Well, their mascot is a wizard, okay? The wizard is carrying a Greek symbol sigma. Over here you have a series of stars here, but you'll notice, ladies and gentlemen, that they are grouped in 2 groups. You have 5 stars here, then you've got 1 star separated from the 5. So 5-1 Area 51, that's what that stands for, okay? The Q symbol is the Greek symbol meaning 0. That is the ideal radar cross signature for stealth aircraft. Radar cross section of 0, that's what you would want. Over here you see this ball falling. I mean, what in the world is a ball falling? What does this have to do with anything? This is not a ball. This is a radar cross-section calibration sphere. That's how the engineers calibrate the equipment. Down here we've got him emitting a lightning bolt. That's indicative of electronic countermeasures. This is a generic aircraft used for stealth aircraft. And then over here we've got the Boeing Phantom Works bird of prey. This is the top view of that aircraft I showed you in the beginning. That's the handle of this sword. So that's the breakdown here. Now, we're moving on to the next one here. And I want to stress that I'm not making up this terminology. The U.S. government is making up this terminology. So, and I generally don't swear, but in this case, we're going to have to go there because this is the government's terminology here. Now, does anyone want to take a stab at what's being deciphered here? We have a strange phantom, and he's carrying a stick, and it says NKAWTG ... nobody. What does that mean? What in the world does this mean? It stands for nobody kicks ass without tanker gas, nobody. That's what this stands for. So what they're saying, if you can get the symbolic encrypted metaphor here, they're saying that nobody flies in the Air Force inventory, not the F-15s, not the F-16s, not the SR-71s when they did fly. Nobody flies, not even the secret aircraft, without the tankers. That's what this patch stands for. That's exactly what they're saying here. The truth is out. I had to get this from an overseas foreign publication. This report was never talked about in American press. They refused to talk about this. Ladies and gentlemen, something happened very significant on the night of September 26, 1994, at a place called RAF Boscombe Down. We believe that a classified, very high-speed stealth aircraft built by Northrop, perhaps by Northrop, a variant of the YF-23, perhaps, on the application of military power at RAF Boscombe Down, they had a nose gear collapse. It had a crew of 2. They sat tandem. They ended up towing this aircraft back to the hangar, which you see here. The very same night, a C-5 Galaxy, a gray-colored C-5 Galaxy, was diverted, was flown to RAF Boscombe Down. The stealth aircraft was visible by numerous eyewitnesses who provided the testimony for this report. They said that it looked very similar to the YF-23 with the exception that it had 2 inward canted vertical stabilizers, a bit different than what you see in this illustration. But the main midsection of this vehicle was covered with a tarp. The nose and aft section was exposed. But what I found really interesting about this case is that when the C-5 Galaxy filed its flight plan with the tower, or ATC, as they were departing, their departure letter identifier for their departing airport where they're going to was KPMD. That's Palmdale. That's Palmdale. That's the Air Force Plant 42 Palmdale. So again, we've got Lockheed having a laboratory there. We've got Boeing having a laboratory there. We've got Northrop as well. So clearly this perhaps was one of our birds that had some type of malfunction for the nose gear. We believe it looks something like this vehicle right here, or very similar to this bottom illustration, but just picture the verticals canted inward. F-19, this is a pilot report we got from a Learjet pilot who was flying at about 15,000 feet. He was about 25 miles north of the remote test site in Nevada. He had just broke out of a series of clouds into his lower left-hand position. He saw this very unusual dark gray, borderline black-shaped craft. It was a flattened football diamond-shaped craft. It had a single X-15 splitter canopy up front. The canopy tapered back toward the upper section of the fuselage of this aircraft. There were control surfaces along the leading and trailing edge of this vehicle. It had 2 NACA air intakes, one on either side of the center line of the aircraft. There was this very interesting ventral and tail dorsal fin arrangement. Then it had these trapezoidal exhaust ports at the aft end of the vehicle. So it dawned on this Learjet pilot that he could have run into this vehicle in IFR traffic. So he called ATC, which was Nellis at the time, and said, Tower, why didn't you advise me of the traffic in my vicinity? And the tower came back and said, Learjet pilot, we're not painting anything on radar, we're just seeing you. So he came back on the radio and said, the heck there isn't. I'm looking at this black football-shaped craft with a tail on top, a tail on the bottom. I almost ran into this thing. There was a pause on the radio. A deeper voice came on the radio and said, such and such Learjet pilot, you will land at Nellis Air Force Base, and when you land at Nellis Air Force Base, you will taxi to the end of the tarmac, and when you taxi to the end of the tarmac, do not depart your aircraft, we will meet you there. And for the next 15 hours, he was debriefed about an aircraft that he never saw. So we have his case on report. We don't know if there are any internal weapon stores to the F-19. We just don't know that. But we do have a good report that there was such a bird that looked almost identical to this right here. MacDill Air Force Base, September 21st, 1967. A good friend of mine who's no longer with us by the name of Jack Pickett was a retired naval combat veteran. He was on destroyers in the Pacific during World War II. He was the base publisher of the NCO Club newsletter at MacDill Air Force Base. This is near Tampa, Florida. He was driving down the perimeter road. He got to the base scrap area, and he saw 4 of the most incredible aircraft that he had ever seen before. And this is an AutoCAD rendering that I put together based on his original sketch. He said they measured 20, 40, 70. The largest one was 116 feet in diameter. They all had tricycle landing gear. They had control surfaces running along the circumference of the vehicle. They had the pilot's section was dead center on the mid portion of the disc. The fuselage tapered back to an extremely high vertical stabilizer. This is an illustration of what the crew of 6 to 8 looked like. This was used as a long-range reconnaissance bomber during the Cold War. And you can notice, ladies and gentlemen, that the flight characteristics of this vehicle would be relatively poor. You've got some very serious stability issues. You've got no look-down capability on approach to landing. So they were scrapping this model at MacDill Air Force Base. We've put together some computer-generated forensic composite illustrations to give you an idea of what this aircraft actually looks like. This is the 40-foot disc and the 116-foot disc in the background here. So what happened is Jack Pickett was authorized to do a full spread story about these aircraft at the base scrapyard in the NCO Club newsletter. Here's another illustration of it being towed on the dry lake bed. And you can see the proposed disclosure program that we're all hoping for. This was an actual U.S. Air Force jet flying wing disc program that flew in the late 1940s up to the early 1960s. They had some stability problems, so they ended up scrapping this model. The large disc right here, the nose gear arrangement had 32 bogies up front, so a very unusual nose gear arrangement for the large craft. You can see here there was a series of 4 exhaust ports at the lower aft end of the vehicle, and then there was a series of bomb bay doors. He could see the seams when Jack walked under them, but he was not actually given authorization to see the internal section of the bomb bay. Jack was given a private briefing about these aircraft at the base headquarters, which was an armed guard facility at MacDill Air Force Base. The general pulled out a series of hundreds of officially stamped U.S. Air Force photographs of these aircraft on the tarmac, in the hangars, in formation flight, which you see here, an F-86 swept jet wing fighter interceptor. And so they were ready to do a whole story on this, and 24 hours before going to press, there was an overflight of a much more advanced vertical takeoff and landing version of this jet disc aircraft. They suffered some type of a propulsion system malfunction. They dropped down to treetop level, very high speed over downtown Miami. The next morning, it was all over the newspapers, it was all over the news, and Jack picked up the Tampa Tribune paper, went into the general's office and said, "General, I believe we've got a problem here because we're getting ready to declassify these aircraft at the scrapyard, but you're denying the existence of this thing that just flew over downtown Miami. What do you want to do about it?" So the general excused himself, called Offutt Air Force Base, Strategic Air Command, the Secretary of the Air Force, and the Department of Defense. He came back and stated that it would be in the better interest of the Air Force to delay publication, and that's where this story died in 1967. So we did have a U.S. Air Force jet flying wing disc program, at least by 1950. Now, between 1982 and 1989, upwards of 25,000 eyewitnesses reported seeing a bat wing, mantis-shaped flying wing over the Hudson Valley, New York area. Thousands of eyewitnesses, very solid case. And The government tried to explain this away as a group of crackpot ultralight pilots flying in formation. And I said, that's absolutely ridiculous, because the eyewitnesses who saw this, number one, said it was a structured vehicle, a structured craft. They could see translucent panels on the lower section of the vehicle, and when you look through these translucent panels, you could see the girder beam structure of the vehicle itself. Also, it was completely silent. Anyone here that knows anything about ultralights knows that they use a 2-cycle Rotax engine that you can hear 5 nautical miles away. So this talk about ultralight pilots in formation is ridiculous. It's a Greek tragedy. Again, Northrop B-2 ATB stealth bomber, I believe that a portion of this $22.4 billion that was spent for the research and development for procurement on the B-2 program may have actually been funneled into a secret version of the B-2, because it had that same triangle trailing edge that you see here on the original version of the B-2 before the 83-84 redesign, which what you see here. So the original B-2 had a single triangle trailing edge, and then at the cost of $1 billion to taxpayers, Air Force changed their mind. They wanted a high-altitude bombing platform. Now they wanted a low-altitude bombing platform. That cost $1 billion for the redesign that you see here. The flying triangles that have been seen all over the world since 1973, in Belgium, gigantic, 300 to 600 feet per side, very large craft. Again, they've been seen all over the world. Primarily, you'll notice that they have a consistent pattern of white lights at the corners of these vehicles. This is a report that came from a family who saw this vehicle in the United Kingdom. Originally, they saw 4 lights only. As they got closer to the vehicle, they could see that in these 4 lights, there was this strange grid pattern, almost identical to what you would see when you looked at a red stoplight up close in an intersection. You'll notice that same grid pattern. Also, they noticed that as this craft would rotate on its axis, you could see different configurations, and they noticed that the skin had this shimmering mercury consistency to it. A very interesting skin on this aircraft. Southern Illinois flying triangle sighting. Highland, Lebanon, Summerfield, Shiloh, Millstadt, DuPont, and O'Fall counties in southern Illinois on January 5th of 2000. Absolutely solid case. Thousands of eyewitnesses, police report, police photograph, even posted on their website, of multiple different triangular craft that were virtually completely silent. One gentleman who was interviewed said that this one looked like a 2-story ranch house. It was over a football field in size as it sped away at a high rate of speed. So we've got this case on file. What could this possibly be? Well, there's a possibility that this is a lighter-than-air vehicle. It could be a neutral buoyancy vehicle. Here's another illustration of what that particular aircraft may actually have looked like. Now, how can we say this? I present this piece of evidence to all of you. A 1976 report from McDonnell Douglas showing diamond, omega, triangular, dish-shaped, lighter-than-air vehicles, neutral buoyancy vehicles, over 600 feet per side, some over 400 feet in diameter, 400-ton cargo lifting capability. So, ladies and gentlemen, in some cases, when you go outside at night, and you look out at night and you see this gigantic black triangle, just remember the possibility exists. It could be one of ours. Lighter-than-air vehicles, are they on the rise? Dirigibles, which may seem like a thing of the past, may be tomorrow's transportation. You'll see this gigantic deltoid pumpkin seed type craft that was built by the Ariane Corporation back in 1976. They already had the technology. Lockheed Skunk Works, East German Flying Triangle crash retrieval. This is an interesting case. Took place during the first month of the Bush Senior administration. Pilots were flying a nap of the Earth mission. They sat tandem, so you'll see that there's a crew of 2 here. For some reason, and we don't know why, they were flying too low. They clipped the top of a pine tree, and this whole vehicle crashed. You'll notice that there are 2 balls up front and 1 on back They have the consistency of pineapples or sea scallops. That's the consistency of the balls here. And then there's these golden spires that come down and support these spheres. We believe that this is the telemetry between the flight controls and the pilots themselves. And if we move forward here, this is what it looked like at the crash site based on one person who was at the crash retrieval team, actually there on site. There was a hull breach on the port side of the vehicle. That caused the tail to tip up at a 15-degree angle of attack. And you'll notice that there was also on the port side of the vehicle here, there was a hull breach as well here. One of these balls, ladies and gentlemen, popped out of its socket. That's what you see right here, popped out of its socket. And they had a little bit of a difficulty trying to recover this sphere. When they finally figured out how to retrieve this, they actually put a box near this ball and they kept the cover open. When they pushed the ball into this box and they covered the lid, the box stood up on its own. So there was some residual force still associated with this sphere, which may be associated with the propulsion system of the vehicle. U.S. Air Force top secret nuclear-powered flying triangle, the quote, TR-3B Astra. This is a very controversial aircraft. This has been kicked around for decades. Comes in two different sizes. One is 300 feet per side, the other is 600 feet per side. What they're doing is they're using something called a magnetic field disruptor. They're taking a liquid mercury, they're pressurizing it to 250,000 atmospheres, they're rotating it at 50,000 RPM. There's a resultant decrease in the localized gravity field by up to 89%, thereby decreasing your G-forces by 89%. That may explain how some of these craft can make these 90-degree right-angle turns at 40 Gs and they only feel a fraction of the G-force. So that's consistent with what we see here. Now, Cash Landrum incident, Huffman, Texas, December 29th, 1980. I definitely want to cover this here. Besides Roswell, personally, I think that this is probably right up there as the most credible UFO case. Highly documented, multiple eyewitnesses. Betty Cash, Vicki Landrum, Colby Landrum were driving down a dark road at night. They saw a star-like craft descend below the cloud cover. It got closer and closer to their vicinity. It eventually parked in front of their vehicle, perhaps less than 1/8 of a mile away, started bobbing just above the asphalt, and sparks and flames would spew out of the bottom of this craft, and every time these sparks and flame came out, this vehicle would come up, and then a little bit later would sink down again, then flames would shoot up, and this went on for a bit of a time. Betty Cash got out of her vehicle to get a closer look. She eventually changed her mind. As she walked back to the vehicle, she touched the car door, was red hot, she burned herself, had to use her leather jacket to get back in the vehicle. As soon as this vehicle departed, which looked like an inverted ice cream cone about 90 feet tall, there were no less, ladies and gentlemen, than 23 double-rotor Chinook CH-47 helicopters chasing this aircraft as it flew by. They eventually, all three of them, suffered from the effects of radiation. So I'm personally going to hold the United States government liable for injuring 3 civilians, and this case has completely been pushed to the side. It's never been settled. Here's what it looked like, just a quick rendering of the helicopters as this went by. So we've definitely got the government involved. Now, they went so far to cover this up as to repave the area where this thing had scorched the black asphalt. That's the level of cover-up for this particular case. So I did a little research here. I did some check finding and some fact finding. I wanted to find out if I could find anything within the literature on this. Aircraft Nuclear Propulsion Program. We're talking about the NEPA program, the Nuclear Energy for Propulsion of Aircraft program. Hearing before the Subcommittee on Research and Development of the Joint Committee on Atomic Energy, Congress of the United States. 86 Congress, first session. This is July 23rd, 1959. If we move forward here and we go down to chart 2, that's down in here, you can see the cost in millions of dollars. This is by 1960 for the Aircraft Nuclear Propulsion Program. So we've got the U.S. Air Force involved, we've got the Atomic Energy Commission involved, we've got the U.S. Navy involved. This is the breakdown. $390 million, $127 million for facilities. The U.S. Navy spent $14 million. Operations for the AEC, or Atomic Energy Commission, were $407 million, and their facilities was $51.6 million. For, ladies and gentlemen, a grand total by 1960 for the aircraft nuclear propulsion program of over $990 million for this program. And we're supposed to believe, as taxpayers, that the government got nothing for this $990 million. Personally, I believe that this was one of our original nuclear-powered aircraft that suffered a hull breach on the port side of the reactor, and fissionable material started spewing out the bottom, and that's what poisoned the civilian witnesses with the radiation. Now, how can I make that statement? In that same report from Congress, they give you 3 cutaway illustrations here. This is a schematic for an atomic turbojet engine with a liquid heat exchanger. So there's one right there. Up here, we've got a different version here. You can see the reactor, the compressor. Over here, there's another one. It says atomic turbojet engine with 2-stage compressor and intermediate cooling of air. Then, as you go down here, look what we have here, ladies and gentlemen. Schematic sketch of an atomic liquid fuel rocket with subcritical reactor. So we're talking about a nuclear rocket system perhaps being used as early as 1960 on some of our very early aerospace programs. Poor visibility shortens Thunderbird show. This is November the 12th of 1988, Norton Air Force Base, San Bernardino, California. And as the newspaper report shows here, the lead Thunderbird pilot, who was a part of this demonstration, decided that the IFR conditions were just so poor at that time, they had to cancel it. So he radioed the other F-16 pilots, said, "Gentlemen, we are done for today. We cannot continue this air show." However, concurrently going on with this exhibit was a top secret dog and pony show taking place inside the, quote, big hangar at Norton Air Force Base. This was to garner support for classified black budget programs. We know that Congressman George E. Brown Jr. was present. We know that Senator Alan Cranston was present in conjunction with high-level military brass. Now, the question is, what did they have in this hangar? Well, Aviation Week Space Technology specifically talked about it. This is December 24th, 1990, scientists and engineers' dreams taking disguise as black aircraft. One aircraft that was in this display in that hangar was what we have termed the pulsar or pumpkin seed demonstrator. It's approximately 100 feet in length, 65 feet wide. The exterior is composed of thermal-resistant, heat-resistant thermal tiles taken directly off the space shuttle. So you can get the sight picture here. Unmanned aircraft, tricycle landing gear, control surfaces along the leading and trailing edge of the vehicle, NACA air intakes on either side of the center line of the aircraft, and then also 121 nuclear launch tubes that could launch a 1/10 megaton warhead in less than a tenth of a second. So how does this aircraft actually fly? Well, once they get the turbojets going at a good speed, and this aircraft is flying at about Mach 3, the leading edge of this vehicle starts glowing red hot. This would be this area right in here. As soon as that happens, ladies and gentlemen, they shut down the engines. They close these NACA air intakes completely shut, making it aerodynamically efficient. When that happens, along this ridge section that you see right here, they have hundreds of tiny fuel injectors. They start introducing a modified liquid methane fuel with a boron-based additive directly into the superheated shock wave. As soon as that happens, it immediately expands and compresses between the superheated shock wave and the tapered after body of this aircraft, pushing it across the sky at about 12,000 miles an hour. That's the level of technology that we had vintage 1988, vintage 1986. So you can see why Reagan was able to barter with Gorbachev to end the Cold War, because when Gorbachev finally got a heads up at the level of technology that we had, he basically said, "We're done. We cannot compete with this technology. We just can't target and track these vehicles. The Cold War was over literally a year or so later. Now, when you've got Aviation Week Space Technology talking about that vehicle, then you switch over to Jane's Defense Weekly, which is the Bible of the military-industrial complex, and you see almost the identical configuration here, this flattened football diamond type configuration where it says, Americans chase hypersonic flight. Aerospace giant McDonnell Douglas is developing aircraft that look and fly like the UFOs in the X-Files. Ladies and gentlemen, you can bank on the fact that such a vehicle actually exists. Another aircraft that was on this particular display was what we've called the Super Stall. This was a single pilot marine attack aircraft that had a conventional tail arrangement that you see here. It had a heads-up display taken directly off the F-16. It had tricycle or outrigger landing gear arrangement. And then it had these very small miniature turbofan engines that tapered back to a platypus exhaust port. And then it had these very interesting, quote, Venetian blind wings. The pilot had the capability to vary or alter the angle of attack on these Venetian blind wings from 0 to 45-degree angle of attack. And by way of the Coanda effect, this could take off vertically, and it had a 30-millimeter Gatling gun taken directly off the A-10 Warthog tank buster. So that was another aircraft that was on display at this Covert Dog and Pony Show. Now, there was a B section, a part 2 to this exhibit. The people who were a part of this exhibit, they boarded a commercial airliner that was being procured by the Air Force at that time. They flew to Air Force Plant 42 Palmdale. They went to the large L-1011 hangar. And inside this hangar, and you can see the bay door here, we're talking about a very large hangar. This is Lockheed Skunk Works facility, Air Force Plant 42 Palmdale. Ladies and gentlemen, there were 3 of these craft hovering off the floor. They were called alien reproduction vehicles, or called flux liners. This craft that you see here was 24 feet in diameter. The next one was 60 feet in diameter. The other one was 130 feet in diameter. They all had similar type configuration. They look very similar, almost like an inverted Jell-O mold. The upper section right here were 6 CCD cameras that were taken, quote, directly from the Vegas casinos. These are pre-existing components existing within the aerospace industry. They could all be slewed in conjunction to produce an artificial image on the inside of the pilot's visor via the Apache heads-up display. There were 4 seat ejection systems taken directly off the F-4 Phantom. So again, you see this lineage of pre-existing aerospace components. Down the central column here, we believe there was 11.25 pounds of enriched uranium-238. There were oxygen tanks along the lower circumference of the vehicle. Then there was this articulated arm here, so you know they're going somewhere, possibly sampling something. And then there were these composite panels that were fastened by Zeus fasteners that were 30 degrees inward canted from the vertical axis, and then a whole series of capacitor plates. So the question is, how does this craft fly? It obviously doesn't fly by the principles of aerodynamics. What's happening here, ladies and gentlemen, is they are taking a high voltage electrical charge. That's why they call this the flux liner. They're feeding it into this 12-foot diameter Tesla coil. Once that happens, there's a magnetic field that forms above this craft, somewhere right up in here, in the form of a toroid donut. The pilot, sitting in this location right here, had a rheostat device. He had the capability of overlaying these field lines onto these capacitor plates, causing pitch, yaw, and roll. And that's how this craft actually flies, based on high principles of electrogravitics and high voltage electronics. Now, the MC who was giving the lecture or the briefing on these aircraft said, quote, that these craft had superluminal performance capabilities. So you could see what we had at that time. Now, how can we prove this? Is there anything to validate this? Ben Rich, who was the former head of Lockheed Skunk Works, he took over the reins of the Skunk Works in Burbank from Kelly Johnson back in 1975. So we're talking about the best of the best here. Before he passed away, he gave a brief telephone conversation with Jim Goodall, who's another aerospace researcher. And he said here, quote, "Jim, we have things out in the desert that are 50 years beyond what you could possibly comprehend. If you've seen it on Star Wars or Star Trek, we've been there, done that, or decided it wasn't worth the effort." Coming directly from Ben Rich, ladies and gentlemen. I personally don't believe you'll hear a better qualified person to speak on classified aerospace hardware than Ben Rich, because he was in the heart of it all. He was the head of Lockheed Skunk Works. So if we want to do a really quick review of some of the aircraft here and do a 15-second crash course in stealth technology here, the worst possible thing you can do in a stealth aircraft is to have a 90-degree right-angle corner. That's the worst thing you can do. Why? Because you reflect those radar waves back to the origin point. So that's the worst thing you want to do. That's why you see here in the B-2 stealth bomber, you've got these smooth contours reflecting the radar waves away from the origin point. And then if you look over here, you see this S-shaped duct. That's used on the B-2 stealth bomber to conceal the turbine blades. That's another technology you want to use. Now, if we move over to this chart here, if each one of these boxes represents a square meter on a radar screen, this is what a B-2 would look like on a radar screen. Now, if we drop this down to the B-1B, that's what you see here. This was under the Carter administration. The B-1B dropped the radar cross signature down to 6 square meters. The B-1B was resurrected under the Reagan administration. Okay, we dropped it down to 0.6 square meters, ladies and gentlemen. Now, we're going to the Northrop B-2 stealth bomber. We've further dropped that radar cross-section down to 0.06. So you see this small dot right here. That's what the B-2 looks like on radar. Now, we further go a magnitude beyond that. We've got the Lockheed F-117A stealth fighter. Radar cross-section between 0.01 and 0.001 square meters, which is this barely discernible dot right here. And then the very first aircraft that I showed you in the beginning of this presentation was the Boeing Phantom Works Bird of Prey. Radar cross-section of minus 70 square meters, or less than a mosquito, ladies and gentlemen. We've got this technology. It's clear we do have the technology now. I want to switch gears at this point. We are going to move in the potential extraterrestrial vehicles. And I want to make one announcement before we get into this material is, personally, I did not make up any of this material. This material was taken directly from the QFOS, that's the Center for UFO Studies, 2457 West Peterson Avenue in Chicago, and the MUFON case file. So there is a historical lineage and paperwork to back this up. The only thing that I did is I did an AutoCAD rendering based from the original sketch. From that rendering, I put together a 3D illustration so that you have a visual aid to go along with the case. September the 4th, 1967, Thessaloniki, Greece. Two brothers were setting up stereo equipment on the top of their third-floor apartment, and one of the brothers turned to the other and said, "What's this?" And he saw a 25-foot diameter dish-shaped craft that was dull gunmetal gray in color. Now, they said it was 20 feet above their location. So this formed a, quote, ceiling as this thing flew by. And he said it was absolutely silent. And he used the term that it did not fly, but it, quote, glided on an oil pathway in the sky. That's the terminology he used as this thing flew by. So we have his case on file. This is his original sketch, about 25 feet in diameter, 6 feet high, and it had a series of white square portholes along the circumference of the vehicle. So we have his case on file, 1967. July 13th, 1959, Blenheim, New Zealand. A very busy housewife was tending to their local farm. She noticed a eerie, quote, eerie green light descend below the cloud cover. It parked about 50 meters from her location. Then there was these two high-intensity beaming green lights that came down. And then she noticed that this thing had two counter-rotating levels, one on top, one on the bottom, and they were spewing out these sparks and flames, and this is counter-rotating. After that, about 30 seconds, the flames stopped. A light came on, and you'll notice there's a clear, transparent, rectangular type square canopy section on the upper section of this vehicle. A very strange being that you see right here, he got up, put his hands on the side of the glass, turned around, got back down. The sparks started up again, and this thing took off at a high rate of speed. And she said that the helmet that this pilot was wearing came all the way down to the shoulders. Very interesting case file. Here you can see how the flames came out of this vehicle. So again, I did not make this up, ladies and gentlemen. It came directly from the QFOS case files. Summer 1970 in Australia, two men were driving down the coast, and this thing passed them from their right side, came up from behind them, startled the driver. Large craft, about 45 feet in diameter, 45 feet high, said that he could see an orange and red rotating light in the bottom section of the vehicle, which I have termed here the flying chess piece, ladies and gentlemen. So again, we've got this case on file. Now I've added a number of auto binder reports. This was a weekly publication where people would actually send in case files, and then these very nice illustrations were put together to go with the case file. I've added these because I personally thought that these were historically significant. March 23rd, 1966, Oklahoma. An electronics expert of Shepherd Air Force Base found his car blocked by an unearthly human-like persons apparently making repairs. They soon flew away without explanation. So you can see the craft of what that actually looked like. July 1967, Detroit, two young boys saw this particular craft. Their case is on file in QFOS, about 100 feet in diameter, 30 feet high. It had a whole series of rotating microprocessor lights which were rotating along the circumference of the vehicle. And here again you can see that it was about 100 feet in diameter. November the 2nd, 1967, Rary, Idaho. Personally, I believe this to be one of the most outlandish, crazy, unusual cases in all ufology. Some of these cases are so ridiculous and crazy. You can't make this stuff up, ladies and gentlemen. This is just incredible. What happened here is two men were driving down the road. Off to the right, this took place at 9:50 p.m. There was a blinding spark light. The next second, they noticed this particular craft was about 6 feet in diameter, parked right in front of the hood of their vehicle. The vehicle stopped. The hatch, the transparent hatch of this vehicle popped up. A being who was described as about 3 feet tall with a backpack on his back floated out of the craft, opened up the car door, got inside the driver's seat as the two people pull off to the side here. The report didn't mention how he touched the pedals of the vehicle. That wasn't talked about in the report. Now, the person who was on the far right, as this is all taking place quickly, he was horrified. He got out of the passenger's door. Now, the other being who was in this vehicle, and I'm not making this up, he floated out and gave chase to the person who just departed the passenger's vehicle. The person who was in the driver's seat, who was still in the vehicle, was in a state of shock, and the being was trying to communicate with this individual in a series of high-frequency chirping bird noises. A few minutes later, the being got out of the vehicle, went back into the craft, and then the other being also got into the craft, and they departed. And you can see here, the consistency of the face of this being was like hamburger meat. I mean, just very, very unusual. Lighted flashing area here, this is about 6 feet down from the lower section of the vehicle. And again here, small men, approximately 3 feet tall, skin was rough, wearing flight packs and tight-fitting flight suits. Here it is, November the 2nd, 1967. This is the actual illustration here. Rary, Idaho, the car of Guy Tosey and Will Begay suddenly came to a halt by itself when a small flying saucer and its two humanoid pilots appeared out of nowhere. So we've got this as a part of the actual official QFOS case files. February the 3rd, 1983, Mobile, Alabama. I love this case. A woman was driving home from visiting a friend. This was late at night. There was a gigantic boom in her vicinity. The car immediately started vibrating, so she pulled off to the side of the road thinking the transmission fell out. She got out of the car, looked under, there was nothing there, there were no problems. She got back into her vehicle, started driving down a separate dirt road, and she noticed a lighted vehicle in the wooded area there. And she described the craft as about 70 to 80 feet tall. It was 210 feet wide. It had a very long elongated section at the back here. And then she said that there was a clear transparent section that was divided into 3 dividers, and there were these beings wearing tight-fitting white flight suits that were oblivious to her. It was as though, quote, they were changing shift. They paid no attention to her whatsoever. This is part of the APRO case file. There was another section of clear transparent windows below that section. Then she said that there was this door that opened from left to right, which she could see an asphalt paved driveway in this craft. To the right of that door were these square rectangular tubing sections there. Then underneath this section here, there were hundreds of 1 foot by 1 foot square mirrors which made up a cross. If you can see this clearly here, there is a cross on the lower section made up of these 1 foot by 1 foot square mirror type plates. And then there was this cupola with beings that were looking at her on the lower section of this vehicle. What I thought was interesting here in this case, though, is that she said when this craft lowered itself to her position, she could see inside this craft, and she could see the girder and crossbeam structure almost identical to the interior bulkheads of a submarine. She also said that there were rivets fastening this particular vehicle together. So I submit to all of you, are we to believe that extraterrestrials are visiting this planet using fasteners and rivets to hold their craft together? There's a possibility that this may be of earthly origin. Now, UFO reports talking about USOs. This is important because over 50% of UFO cases are in point of fact USOs, or unidentified submerged objects. We've got 3 different reports from 3 different locations on this planet, all talking about the same phenomenon. Invisible Residence by Ivan T. Sanderson. The Reality of Underwater UFOs, a very well-referenced book. I can't recommend this enough. They talk about this particular case. A Brazilian scientist aboard an icebreaker in Admiralty Bay, Antarctic, was shocked out of his senses when he saw a strange craft shoot up out of the sea through more than 37 feet of solid ice. I mean, think about the implications of what this means. 1965 Antarctica Operation Deep Freeze, where they saw this gigantic bullet-shaped craft break through 37 feet of solid ice, and then where it broke through, the water started boiling and bubbling over, and the ice chunks were flipped off onto the hard surface of the ice. Now, we can do that too, right? We can take our nuclear-powered submarines and we can break up through the ice, but the only difference is we can break through about 37 inches of ice. You try to break through 37 feet of solid ice, you're going to just shred this conning tower. The whole submarine is going to go down to the bottom of the ocean, absolutely. Another report of a USO, April 19th, 1959, near Japan, aboard a fishing boat, the amazed crew spotted 2 saucers diving into the ocean at terrific speed, yet no wreckage was ever found, as if the UFOs had deliberately submerged for an underwater trip. June 3rd, 1961, in Italy, a gentleman and his companions felt waves rocking their motorboat, then saw a huge UFO rise up out of the sea and sail off through the sky as if equally at home in the ocean or in the air. 1882, this is interesting. Near Ascension Isle, a British steamer came upon a gigantic UFO floating in the ocean, at least 800 feet long, or nearly as big as the Queen Elizabeth, which slowly sank beneath the waves and vanished from sight. So we're talking about craft that can come up from the bottom of the ocean and go into space, or craft that can come from the space as the origin point and then go down into the ocean. However, as we all know, the Wright brothers plane, or the Wright Flyer, wasn't invented and flown until December 17th, 1903, but we're talking about cases that predate that by a significant margin. November 13th, 1833, a crowd on both the American and Canadian sides saw a peculiar square-shaped UFO hover over Niagara Falls for an hour, after which it sped away toward the ocean. So again, a very interesting case. December 1976, Dana Point, California. A woman and her 2 children were driving down an adjacent road of Pacific Coast Highway, and they were shocked to see this, quote, fat frisbee, as her terminology indicated, hover right in front of their vehicle. This is the view looking outside the windshield. Between 3 and 5 minutes, it had a whole series of multicolored computer microprocessor lights and a blinking red light on top. Here's the actual police report and newspaper report of it here. This is the view looking outside the windshield, and you'll notice at the bottom here it says evaluation. This is the official evaluation. Closeness, duration, silence, and multitude witness rule out conventional explanations. Conclusion, tentatively judged a UFO. So we have their report. Fat Frisbee, 1976, Dana Point, California. A Fantastic Fleet, October the 12th, 1796, way before man-powered flight. On Columbus Day, over 170 years ago, Canadian observers reported an astonishing fleet of airships, or UFOs, with portholes and visible occupants sailing over the Bay of Fundy. July 1868, in Chile, people were frightened by a giant armor-plated machine covered with steel scales whose twin searchlight eyes stabbed down brilliantly. So again, who had the technology to fly craft that were heavier than air back in 1868 with high-intensity lights that came down? 1868. Homestead Air Force Base, 1973. Richard talks about this case in his book. It's no secret that Jackie Gleason and Richard Nixon were very good friends. They both had an interest in golf. They both had an interest in UFOs, especially Jackie Gleason. Well, one day, perhaps at Homestead Air Force Base, now there are some people who say that this took place at MacDill Air Force Base, so there's some good documented evidence to indicate that it may have actually taken place there. Anyway, right around the 9th hole, the subject of UFOs came up, and Jackie Gleason turned to Richard Nixon and said, Mr. President, you know, I've been following this for decades. I've got a large collection. That collection is now at the University of Miami. You know, what's the deal with the UFOs? Are they real? Is it a threat to national security? Can you tell me anything? And he said, Jackie, if you can make yourself available later this evening, I might be able to provide you with an answer. So right around 12 midnight, Richard Nixon shows up alone. Now this has been disputed, but it has been confirmed that Richard Nixon did get away from the Secret Service on more than one occasion. He shows up at Jackie Gleason's house alone, personally drives Jackie Gleason to Homestead Air Force Base, and shows Jackie Gleason not only extraterrestrial bodies, but debris that went with the bodies. It didn't say what crash retrieval it came from, but as this report here, Jackie Gleason, I saw bodies of dead aliens at top secret Air Force Base, quote, we've got them, directly from Jackie Gleason. So he's talked about it. His ex-wife has confirmed the story. So we've got her case on file as well. Interesting report here, USS Franklin Delano Roosevelt, late 1958, Gitmo, Cuba. Very, very good case. This is the original sketch based on the testimony of the witness who was on the aircraft carrier when this actually took place. A large 100-foot-long cigar-shaped craft that was gunmetal gray in color hovered above the ship for about 10 minutes. There was a series of square portholes with a being looking outside of these square portholes. That's what you see right here. So not only do we have independent secondary confirmation from the eyewitness, who was on the actual deck of the aircraft carrier, but we have the radar trace cases and confirmation from the ship's radar who confirmed that this was actually there. As it departed at a higher rate of speed, it turned to a bright red orange in color. Now what's interesting is, why would they pick the USS FDR? Why is this? And why is it that the FDR had more than one encounter? This happened over 4 times on this particular aircraft carrier. Well, it could be that the USS FDR had these encounters because it was the first aircraft carrier to carry thermonuclear warheads. So that may be one reason why it had all these sightings. October 13th, 1917, a gathering for a, quote, faith healing, people outside the town of Fatima, Portugal, sighted an enormous flying coin. Number of witnesses, ladies and gentlemen, 70,000. So can all 70,000 be wrong? October 9th, 1972, Long Island, New York. Couple was driving home. It was late at night. They saw this particular craft, which they called a, quote, elongated ellipse. I'm calling it the flying iron. It had a whole series of lights that were elongated on the bottom section of the craft. It had these 2 poles that came up on the terminating section of the triangle. There was a red light on the port side of the vehicle and a green light on the right side of the vehicle. And then there was a small wire that came across the top, absolutely silent. There were no strings attaching it to anything. Very interesting propulsion system. Does this have anything to do with, quote, ion propulsion, electric propulsion? Does this have anything to do with the NEPA propulsion system? The technology is there. We've demonstrated that the funding was there as well. 1966, over South Vietnam. Very interesting case. A B-52 crew, that's this little dot right here. This took place at night, so you get the sight picture here. Approximately between 1/4 and 1/2 mile in diameter over South Vietnam. They basically flew around this craft, which was a gigantic dish-shaped craft. They said that there was a series of rotor blades along the lower circumference of this vehicle that were spinning. Now, they flew around this thing about 5 times. Gun cameras were going off, so we've got that. They said that there were 28 levels of clear transparency looking into the dome, and they could see beings looking back at them. However, that's not the real interesting part of this case. The interesting part is, and this is the AutoCAD rendering of this case, is when this craft departed. This is a sketch done by Mark McCandlish, who interviewed one of the crew members on this B-52. So there's an FBI report for this somewhere. As this craft departed at night, it opened up some type of a very strange wormhole, and the pilots could see blue sky, white clouds as this thing departed, and then a few seconds later, it trickled back to darkness. And that's what happened as this craft actually departed. You can see a rendering of what this encounter may have actually looked like. Very large, between 1/4 and 1/2 mile in diameter. Belated UFO sighting took place 10 years after the original sighting took place, so the giggle factor was still in place by 1978. This gentleman saw this particular craft descend at a slow speed, drop down 500 feet very rapidly, made a dead stop, started moving off to the right. He saw a series of blue and white lights on the bottom section of this craft. Then he said that there was this clear, transparent relief section showing the interior of the vehicle. So you can see that section right in here showing the interior of the vehicle. This is the AutoCAD rendering based on his original sketch. According to him, over 1 football field in diameter, and this is the rendering based on his original sketch. The Flying Truss Bridge, directly from the QFO case files, 2457 West Peterson Avenue. Now, I've boxed in his statement here, quote, craft caused pictures to fall off the living room wall and shook the entire house as it passed by overhead. 1 football field in length. Don't know how he can gauge how much this thing weighed, but he said that there was a catwalk in this location right here. There was a clear, transparent glass section in this location here. And then an interesting side point here, I want to bring your attention to this. Structure of craft resembled an old truss bridge with rusted metal and vintage era rivets. So again, I ask the question, are we to believe that extraterrestrial vehicles, perhaps a million years in advance of us, are visiting this planet, flying in or around a craft using rusted rivets to hold their craft together? It just doesn't make any sense. To me, I think that this perhaps was a man-made vehicle. I-5 UFO case, July 12, 2004, Central Valley, California. This craft, which was determined to be a Vulcan bomber, crossed between a Vulcan bomber and a space shuttle, had 3 high-intensity beams right on each side of the wingtip and one below the nose of the craft, started making this very interesting elliptical flight pattern, dropping 5 feet over traffic on the I-5 in California, violating all FAA regulations. So whoever was flying this is going to jail because you're not allowed to fly 500 feet near any thing in unobstructed, unpopulated area, but this thing was no more than 5 feet over the traffic. One other report here, 2001. We've got another report, Detroit, 8 miles west of the city. This thing flew directly over his head, flying triangle, black in color, completely silent. We've got his case on file as well. Police report, 1997, of this that came directly into Coast to Coast. He saw this particular craft completely silent as well. Reunion Island, France, this particular craft was seen by one gentleman who was pulling grass for his rabbits, looked over to the right side, saw this elliptical shaped craft that had a transparent section in the forward portion of the vehicle and 2 blue sections at the extremities. It had a Michelin man being inside. There were actually 2 of these. And then as this departed, there was radioactivity left not only on his clothes, but at the site. Geiger counters confirmed that there was radioactive residue at the site there. So, ladies and gentlemen, I hope I presented some of the cases from MUFON and the QFOS case files. I will leave it to your judgment, ladies and gentlemen, to determine which category these craft fall in, either the man-made category or the extraterrestrial category, and I want to thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Michael.